Kamau Okafor was the most feared businessman in all of Lagos. His name carried weight, his influence was vast, and his hunger for power was unquenchable. He crushed competitors without a second thought, his empire growing on the ruins of others. Wealth and status were his only concerns, and he would stop at nothing to maintain his position. Many despised him, some envied him, but no one truly cared for him. Until the day his closest friend, Chidi, made him an unexpected proposition. While surveying one of his many properties in a bustling Lagos market, Chidi pointed towards a ragged woman sitting by a crumbling wall. Her name was Zola, a street beggar whose weary face bore the scars of hardship. Chidi smirked as he turned to Kamau. "I bet a man like you would never consider marrying a woman like that," Chidi said. Kamau barely glanced at her before scoffing. "Look at her. Dirty, poor, useless. Not even fit to step into my house." Chidi chuckled. "Marry her for 1 year. Treat her like a wife. No cheating, no avoiding her. If you succeed, I'll give you $10 million. If you fail or refuse, you lose everything to me." Kamau clenched his fists. The woman disgusted him, but he would never back down from a challenge. His pride and greed would not allow it. "I accept," he declared, sealing his fate with a handshake. He did not know Zola had overheard everything. A hidden agenda. What Kamau didn't know was that Zola had her own reasons for agreeing to this cruel arrangement. Years ago, Kamau had stolen everything from her. Her father, Baba Tund, had owned a small but thriving electronics shop. It had been the heart of their family, passed down from generation to generation. But Kamau wanted the land, and when Baba Tund refused to sell, Kamau used his connections to have the property seized on false tax evasion charges. Overnight their lives fell apart. The loss shattered Baba Tund. The despair consumed him, and in his sorrow, he took his own life. Zola, pregnant at the time, found him hanging from the rafters of their dilapidated home. As she wept over his lifeless body, she went into early labor. Her child did not survive. Her husband, unable to bear the misfortune, abandoned her, leaving her alone with nothing but grief and desperation. Forced onto the streets, she spent years begging, barely surviving, dreaming of the day she could bring Kamau to his knees. Then, one day, fate delivered an opportunity in the form of an outrageous wager. Zola did not hesitate. She would marry him. She would enter his world. And she would make him suffer. The marriage of deception. Their wedding was a cold, impersonal affair. Kamau barely concealed his distaste, but Zola played her part, her face unreadable. When they arrived at his lavish penthouse, he flung open the doors, his disgust clear. "I cannot believe I have to share my home with the likes of you," he sneered. Zola said nothing. Instead, she walked past him, removed her tattered dress, and slid into his luxurious bed. Kamau recoiled in horror. "You filthy woman," he shouted. "I can't even look at you." That night, Kamau stormed to the living room, furious. But as he fumed, Zola smiled. The battle had begun. Over the next few months, she became his nightmare. She disrupted his business, embarrassed him at meetings, and ignored every attempt to control her. She left his expensive suits in disarray, filled his bathroom with cheap, overpowering perfume, and made sure her presence was impossible to ignore. Kamau, used to command and obedience, found himself powerless against her defiance. Nothing worked, not threats, not bribes, not kindness. She was unaffected, unbothered, until one night he finally understood why. The truth revealed. Kamau came home late, exhausted and angry. Zola was sprawled on the couch, eating fruit, watching TV. She barely acknowledged him. "I've had enough," he snapped. "You're ruining my life. I could destroy you." Zola finally looked at him, her eyes hard. "You already did." She told him everything. The shop, the eviction, her father's death, her stillborn child. Kamau's heart pounded. He had known of the business deal, but not the human cost. He had seen numbers, not people. But now, the consequences of his actions stood before him, living, breathing, and filled with a cold fury. I didn't know, he stammered. Zola laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. You didn't care. For the first time in his life, Kamau felt shame. The road to redemption. From that moment, something inside Kamau shifted. He started to see the truth of who he had been, and it sickened him. Zola continued dismantling his empire piece by piece, but he did not fight her. Instead, he faced the people he had wronged. He listened to their anger, their pain, and he resolved to change. He liquidated his wealth, using the money to rebuild the lives he had destroyed. He worked in the same markets he had once sought to control, teaching young entrepreneurs. For the first time in his life, he worked not for power but for purpose. Zola watched, waiting for him to fail, for him to revert to the ruthless man she had married. But he didn't. Even as his fortune crumbled, he kept going. A year passed. Kamau met Zola at the courthouse, the divorce papers in hand. I know I can never undo what I did, he said. But I will spend the rest of my life trying. Zola studied him, searching for deceit. But the man before her was not the same one she had wed. Maybe we start with coffee, she finally said. And so, slowly, cautiously, they rebuilt something new. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. And in time, that understanding grew into something neither had expected. Years later, Kamau proposed again, not as a bet, but as a man who had truly changed. Zola, after a long silence, said yes. They built a new life, one rooted in kindness and service. Kamau continued his work of atonement, and Zola, against all odds, found healing. When their daughter was born, Kamau held her close, tears streaming down his face. He had once measured his success in power and wealth. Now he measured it in love, in family, in the knowledge that he had become a better man. He had lost everything, but in losing it, he had found himself. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.